There was once a forest that caught fire. For days, everything burned. Trees that had stood for centuries collapsed into ash. Birds disappeared. Animals fled. When the smoke finally cleared, people looked at the land and reached the same conclusion. Nothing will ever grow here again. But the forest had a secret. Hidden beneath the ashes were seeds that had spent years waiting for exactly this moment. Seeds that could only open after being exposed to unbearable heat. Without the fire, they would have remained asleep forever. Sometimes I wonder if the human heart is built the same way. Because some parts of us don't awaken through happiness. They awaken only after loss. Heartbreak is one of the strangest experiences a human being can go through. One day, life has a rhythm. You know who you will text first. You know whose voice will end your day. You know the future you have quietly begun building inside your mind. And then, almost overnight, that future disappears. Not because it happened, but because it never will. People often think heartbreak is about missing a person. It isn't. Not entirely. You don't just mourn their absence. You mourn the conversations you'll never have, the places you'll never visit together, the anniversaries you'll never celebrate, the ordinary Monday evenings that once seemed too ordinary to appreciate. You grieve memories that were never created, as though they had already existed. And that is why heartbreak feels so much like death. Not because your heart stops beating, but because a part of your identity does. The version of yourself that laughed at those jokes. The version that instinctively reached for the phone every time something beautiful happened. The version that believed it already knew what tomorrow looked like. That person doesn't simply disappear with another human being. They disappear with the life that only existed because that person was in it. Perhaps that's why we say, I don't feel like myself anymore. Because in some ways, you aren't. Death is not always the ending of a heartbeat. Sometimes, it is the ending of a self. That is the peculiar cruelty of human imagination. It allows us to live tomorrow before tomorrow arrives. And when tomorrow is taken away, our hearts mourn it as though it had already become yesterday. Perhaps that's why heartbreak hurts in places words can never quite reach. Because you're not bearing one loss, you are bearing hundreds. The version of yourself that laughed more freely, the version that believed love had finally found a home, the version that felt seen, safe, chosen. And perhaps the hardest goodbye isn't the goodbye to another person. It's goodbye to the person you became while loving them. That is why, after heartbreak, people often look into the mirror and whisper, I don't even recognize myself anymore. Of course, you don't. The person who walked into that relationship and the person who walked out of it are not the same. They simply cannot be the same. Love changes us, But loss changes us differently. It strips away certainty. It questions our worth. It makes us replay conversation we can no longer change. We search for hidden meanings inside old messages. We wonder whether one different sentence, one different decision, one different day could have rewritten the ending. We bargain with memories. We argue with silence. We fight battles that exist only inside our own minds. Songs become places you avoid. Certain streets become impossible to drive through. A familiar perfume drifting through a crowded room can undo weeks of healing. Someone casually mentioning their name can collapse an entire afternoon. It isn't weakness, it is grief. Grief has no interest in calendars. It arrives uninvited. It lingers without permission. And just when you think it has finally left, it returns, carrying another memory you had forgotten was still alive. Every human civilization has tried to explain what happens after a soul survives its own fire. Some call it faith, some call it rebirth. The ancient Greeks imagined a bird. They called it the phoenix. Ancient cultures told stories about a magnificent creature that, at the end of its life, was consumed by fire, only to rise again from its own ashes. People often remember the ending of that story. They remember the rebirth, but they forget the fire. The phoenix is not reborn despite the fire. It is reborn because of it. Perhaps that is why this ancient myth has endured for centuries. Because every deep heartbreak leaves behind ashes. The ashes of trust, the ashes of certainty, the ashes of the life you thought you were going to have. And in those moments, almost everyone makes the same mistake. We try to gather the ashes and rebuild what was. We search for the old version of ourselves. But ashes cannot become a tree again. Healing isn't about putting those ashes back together. It's about allowing a new self to emerge, one that carries wisdom without losing the capacity to love. The phoenix doesn't promise that you will get your old life back. It promises that what comes next can be stronger than what existed before. Not because you'll forget, not because the pain wasn't real, but because suffering has a quiet way of reshaping us. It teaches us where our strength truly lives. It softens our judgments. It deepens our compassion. And sometimes it introduces us to a version of ourselves we never would have met if life had unfolded exactly as we had planned. The fire changes us, but it doesn't have to destroy us. Perhaps that's the secret hidden inside every heartbreak. What feels like an ending is often the slow beginning of a different life. One you cannot yet imagine because you are still standing in the smoke. Remember that forest? The one everyone believed was dead? They looked at the ashes and saw an ending. The forest looked at the ashes and knew they were only the beginning. Perhaps the human heart keeps the same secret. When love leaves, all we can see is what the fire has taken. But life is already preparing something our grief cannot yet recognize. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't arrive all at once. It grows quietly beneath the ashes, long before anyone notices the first sign of green. Maybe heartbreak is precisely what earns us the right to call ourselves human. No other creature writes poems because it was left behind. No other creature listens to the same song for years because one person is gone. No other creature imagines future that never happened and mourns them as though they were memories. Heartbreak is the price we pay for being able to imagine a life with another person. And that same imagination is what gives us art, music, compassion, forgiveness, hope. That, to me, is the real story of the Phoenix. It isn't a story about a bird. It is a story about us. About every person who has stood in the ashes of a life they thought would last forever and found the courage to keep walking. We don't rise because we are never burned. We rise because somehow, even after the fire, the human heart still finds the courage to believe in love again. And maybe years from now, when you look back at the fire that almost destroyed you, you won't remember it as the day your life ended. You'll remember it as the day the first hidden seed finally began to grow. Until that day, let's keep walking. I'll see you in the next thought. Take care.